supporters. Today we have a slightly different topic, but an equally important conversation that I believe we as Indians must also have. At the borders of United States, especially along Mexico, almost 2,000 children have been separated from their families, from their parents in just the last 6 weeks. The number goes higher if you actually count what has happened in the last 2 to 3 months. Effectively, we are given to understand 45 children are sent to refugee settlement centers, separated from their parents, with them having absolutely no idea when will they get to see their families next. The visuals are really heartbreaking. The clips where you can hear these children cry would shake anybody's conscience. Clearly not the President of United States. You know what they did when they were called out by United Nations and its Human Rights Council? They decided to exit UNHRC. United States believes that it is a crusader of human rights. But United Nations Human Rights Commissioner Council isn't. That, ironically, is their belief. In fact, I'm going to read out some of the comments that were made by those in the Trump administration. HRC enables abuses by absolving wrongdoers through silence. This is what they say. They've gone on to say that US will not take lectures from hypocritical bodies and institutions, meaning the United Nations Human Rights Council, which is a cesspool, Nikki Haley says, of political bias. We cannot remain part of a body that makes a mockery of human rights. Human Rights Council has become a protector of human rights abusers. Funny how United States misses the irony in its own words. But tonight, the idea is to not sit here and bash the Trump administration. Their own media does that a lot. The idea is to debate the value of United Nations Human Rights Commission and the Council. Is it really effective in any sense in the year 2018? What purpose is it really serving us? Yes, of course, at any given point of time in our world, grave human rights violations, high number of intense atrocities are being carried out, and there is no denying that fact. But when big nations, developed or developing or otherwise, begin to not care about what the other nations are saying, about what UN is saying, then what can really one do? That is the big debate tonight. Let's say good evening to our guests. Joining me this evening, Kamal Mitra Chenoy, Foreign Affairs expert, Pramit Paul Chaudhary, Foreign Editor for Hindustan Times, Mr. Shashank is a former diplomat with us this evening. I'll also have Meera Shankar, former diplomat, also with us this evening, and Karuna Nandi, a lawyer with the Supreme Court. Let me go across to Meera Shankar first, if she can hear me. Good evening, ma'am. How do you view what has happened today? For a year at least, the Trump administration has been threatening to walk out, but to do it at this time.
I think it's a sad reflection on what the United States has become. It is very far from its own ideals, and it has been criticized by a number of people in the United States, and there's quite a bit of mobilization on the issue. But the Trump administration has responded by walking out of the UN Human Rights Council. The sight of those children, in the cages, 2,300 of them, some really toddlers, wailing and crying, it's something which is really indefensible. Hello?
Yes, please go. Please go ahead, Meera Shankar.
Well, as I said, it's something which is indefensible.
Yes.
Particularly given that the US has been at the forefront of lecturing the world on human rights and has seen itself as being a country which expands the sphere of freedom, not just within the United States, but worldwide. And then now you come to this. where the human rights of illegal immigrants are being violated by children being taken away from their parents.
Okay, let me go across to Mr. Shashank and ask him this question as well. United States administration more or less tried to portray that because UNHRC will be investigating these so-called crimes in Palestine or carried out by Israel in Gaza Strip, and they are against that investigation, which is why they are backing out, because they back Israel. Do you think that's largely the reason?
Concerned, one can see that this issue of the Palestinian people and the Israeli conduct has been a subject of the review by this Human Rights Council, and that is the main reason why the Americans initially were not willing to join the Human Rights Council and have now decided to move out of it, because they would not mind if there are any officials in the United Nations who are carrying out a kind of a human rights survey, because they themselves also carry out human rights surveys on different countries. But what they don't like is that other countries sitting together in a council or whatever body where Americans do not have a veto right to give any kind of description or prescription for America's friends. And America has now right now decided that its main friend in the Middle East will be Israel and maybe a few other countries, and so it wants to set the record completely different in the Middle East. So that is a different issue. I think as far as this part is concerned of the Mexican families being separated, that is a very important issue, and I think the American people need to speak out on this subject. Unfortunately, even the Republicans are divided on this issue. I mean, many of them are still supporting the president. So therefore, this is a matter where the Americans have to realize, I mean, are they talking of the human rights only of a certain kind of people who belong to the Rust Belt in America, or does it belong to the other people also who want to come to America, who have been coming to America with the Statue of Liberty there beckoning them to the United States?
In fact, we're given to understand it's not just illegal immigrants or those who are seeking asylum in the United States who are having to go through this and having to bear the brunt of this separation of family policy that seems to be in place without any law, but also people who are living there in Oregon, including some Indians who have been detained and the families separated, and it is really quite horrible what's going on there. But so is also what went on in Myanmar when the genocide took place, the kind of mass killings that happened in Syria, the atrocities that were carried out in North Korea. So, Kamal Mitra Chenoy, the question I really want to address tonight is, what is the point of this UNHRC? Does it really serve any purpose then?
Well, look, if you don't have the Human Rights Council, there is no other body where human rights where people and countries who are very powerful completely violate human rights, and there's no one to speak to them. That is why the US has moved out of the HCR, because they don't want to be held accountable, though they themselves are often quick to hold other countries accountable. And one thing we should remember, that what is happening now is that the Republicans, almost en bloc, are supporting the separation of families, whereas the Democrats, who were trying to work out some conciliatory policy, have been sidelined by the Republicans. And at the root of it all is President Trump's great idea of having a wall separating Mexico from the United States. And since he can't get the money or get Mexico to give him money, which they won't, and he wants to then, all right, separate them, and they're kept in huge warehouses owned by Amazon and other, Walmart and other, which are not in any case suitable for people to stay in. And to separate young children from their parents is a profoundly anti-human rights thing, and that is why the US, in order to avoid that, has shifted across. And one last point, it also supports countries who themselves violate human rights. Israel, for example, is a notorious human rights offender.
Yes.
So President Trump's policy basically is this: it's my way or the highway. You have to agree with him. If the Democrats don't agree, if liberals don't agree, if the American media doesn't agree, too bad for them.
So that essentially seems to be policy of so many big nations today. I don't think Vladimir Putin much cares about what the rest of the world has to say. I don't think Kim Jong-un cares much about what UNHRC or all of United Nations has to tell North Korea. And that is my problem. What is the point of highlighting these atrocities? What is the point of telling it to the nation members when nothing is going to be done about it? Yesterday we had the UNHRC chief call out United States for this policy of separation of families of immigrants. Today, United States has walked out. That's effectively what has happened. I'm just quickly going to go across to Mr. Chidanand Rajgatta, the foreign editor for Times of India, joining us from Washington right now. Mr. Rajgatta, thank you for speaking to us. How is this being viewed, the decision by the Trump administration to exit UNHRC, to withdraw from UNHRC? How is this being viewed in states? Do people buy the argument that this is largely in support of Israel, or do they also understand the fact that Trump's decisions when it came to the separation policy are also being questioned globally?
Well, obviously, there are two very distinct constituencies in this country, and the liberals and the civil liberties activists, human rights activists, are dismayed that the Trump administration is withdrawn. I think this is always on the cards ever since. I think President Trump had said this a long time ago, and it was always on the cards. It was going to happen sometime or the other. It turns out that it comes at a very awkward time for the administration with the separation of immigrant families issue. But we have to understand one thing: this is a very complex issue. There are no simple answers to this. Every country in the world is always happy to point out human rights violations elsewhere, but they find it hard to turn the torch on themselves. This is true of the United States. This is true of India. They are always quick to recognize human rights violations in Pakistan, in Saudi Arabia, elsewhere. But there are, strategic silences when it comes to either examining it internally or examining it in the case of allies, which is a problem with the United States. Saudi Arabia is not exactly a paragon of human rights.
Absolutely.
Virtues, and nor is Israel, for that matter. The way out I see is every country, because it's always embarrassing when somebody points out to your weaknesses. I wish in an ideal world every country should have strong domestic human rights organizations, civil liberties organizations. In the U.S., for whatever else U.S. faults are, the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, is a very powerful organization. It's long established. It has done terrific work. In India, on and off, the National Human Rights Commission has done wonderful work.
Right.
These institutions ought to be strengthened, because I think at the end of the day, particularly in democratic societies, an internal mechanism probably works better. And there are also delicate domestic situations. We have a very difficult situation in Kashmir, for instance. There are human rights violations on all sides.
Yes.
It's not just the army, but it's not that the extremists are very kind and loving either. So I think domestic organizations which are credible, which have some amount of power backing, an institutional mechanism is probably the way to go.
So let me also ask you this question, Mr. Rajgatta. The Trump administration is also obviously under fire for this new policy that they have internally put in place to push back immigrants. And as a result of that, the separation of the families that's taking place, almost 2,000 children in just the last 6 weeks have been separated from their parents. Just a few hours ago, Donald Trump tweeted saying that he's going to look at it, yes, and probably come out with a bill with a better law, a better solution maybe than what is on right now. Does that mean that currently the Trump administration doesn't have a longer-term policy in mind?
Well, I think the urgency of the situation is now driving everyone to demand immediate action. And as we speak, I think I'm watching President Trump say that he's probably going to sign some kind of executive action, which is what people have always said. Yesterday the Democrats said, "Look, the president can turn it around with a stroke of a pen." But there's politics involved. Trump and his minions want to put the blame on Democrats. And in fairness, here's a point which a lot of people miss. This has been happening since President Obama's time. It would be hard, and I know Obama fans will find it hard to absorb this. But it was President Obama who and his administration which actually instituted this whole detention center, separation of families, etc.
Right.
Except that it was not being done. in such a the Trump administration expanded on that and made it a zero tolerance, which means everybody's prosecuted, all kids and parents are separated. During the Obama time, it was more discretionary. So in that sense, this is a long-standing problem. Look, people don't understand that the immigration and illegal immigration issue did not start with Trump or Obama or even Bush or even Clinton. It goes back generations.
No, absolutely. It's the way it is actually dealt with. And like you pointed out, the policy existed even in the previous administration, but it's only in the last few months that we've seen the way it has been implemented. That is why it's come to the forefront. Thank you so much, Mr. Rajgatta, for speaking to us and bringing the viewers of Mirror Now the view really from United States. Let's go back to our panelists on some of those issues that we've raised right now. And I just want to explain to our viewers who may have missed out of what's happening in United States right now. With this new immigration crackdown, anybody who's, for example, turning up from Mexico at the borders seeking asylum in United States doesn't have the requisite permission. Sometimes we're given to understand from reports in international media that even those who have gone to the government seeking permission have been detained. So illegal immigrants are being detained, and then the families are being separated until the entire procedure is over, which could take days or weeks or maybe months. Little children are being taken away to refugee settlement camps, away from their parents in a new country where they probably don't even understand the language, with absolutely no clue when they will meet their families next. That is what is happening in the United States right now, the country that has decided to walk out of the Human Rights Council. So let's get back to our guests, and I want to take that point to Pramit Pal Chaudhary. Pramit Pal Chaudhary, what is the point of having this UNHRC? Can we really put any kind of pressure on Donald Trump right now to fix this?
If you're talking about the United Nations Commission for Human Rights, let's make this very clear. This is an organization, as some of the other speakers have mentioned, that has zero credibility. It does not have any binding authority. Its members are council. Well, the United Nations has no authority to actually enforce human rights around the world because its members have not voted to do so. So it has never been a particularly strong organization. It has little more than a voice. It can say things, and that's about it. And a lot of its members, as has been mentioned earlier, are themselves violators of human rights and join the council largely to humiliate or to embarrass another country who they don't like. So Arab countries have traditionally joined to go after Israel. Pakistan and India have fought repeatedly within the council. And it doesn't really have any standing. So it's not an organization, it's an organization America has walked out of before. It walked out of it in the Bush administration. India has had problems with the council as well. It's an organization that frankly does not have much credibility in the international system. It can point out errors, but it's not taken very seriously. And I think what you really should be looking, as Chidanand Rajgatta mentioned, is what is the domestic structures in each of these countries to handle human rights. So a report by Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International on the NGO level, or what you could do at the judicial level in at least the democracies of the world, is really where human rights has to be approached. So if America, as we saw, we're hearing Trump is planning to at least, he's not going to allow refugees into the country, but he will probably allow that the children and parents will not be separated anymore. But it will be a consequence of the domestic pressure within his country. It will not be because of the United Nations or, for that matter, any other country. And the one thing I have to admit about the Trump administration, it does not lecture other countries about human rights for the most part, because it doesn't care at all about human rights inside its own country or outside. It's been very clear about that. So I don't think that they've been inconsistent on that point of view. So human rights, and I would argue right now across the world, human rights is unfortunately in a recession. Very few countries are very interested. Europe, which has traditionally been the leader of international human rights policies, you're seeing already Italy refusing to take refugee ships coming across the border. You're seeing this happening in Greece. You're seeing anti-immigration parties coming up all across Europe, also making an argument more or less very similar in some to a lesser degree than what Trump is. And I should point out that India is not much better. On the Rohingyas, for example, we have taken a very strong position that even while they may be victims of genocide, India will not allow Rohingya refugees into the country.
Yes.
So this is, I think, almost, I wouldn't say a global phenomena, but it's more or less true that across the world, refugees and asylum seekers are not getting a good deal.
So let me take that point that you made across to Karuna Nandi. Karuna Nandi, do you agree that largely in at least today's age, international commissions or organizations will probably not have any effect on any of these countries, only maybe internally if there are domestic organizations or citizens initiatives who pressurize the government that we can actually tackle human rights violations better?
You know, the reason that much of this regime was established was after the genocide in, the genocide of the Jews during the Holocaust. And I think the world came together at that point saying that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and a certain international regime will apply regardless of what individual countries may think about their majoritarian, genocidal domestic power. I think what the speakers before me have failed to, there are two egregious failures in not just why I single them out, but in some of the conversation around this. One is that there is a lack of recognition of international law and how it works. And the second is that it's, it's a sort of, oh well, this is the way things are, and, sort of a shrugging of shoulders. Now, the thing is that the US is a repeat offender. If you look at the Child Rights Convention, for instance, I mean, they were one of, I think the last time I looked, one of 2 countries in the world. They're possibly the only country in the world, right, who have not signed up to it. Now, who objects to the rights of children?
Yeah.
The United States.
Yeah.
Had they signed up to it, they would be in violation of Article 9, which prohibits the separation of children from their parents without a judicial application of mind, and if it's not in the best interest of the child, which is why I think the world is horrified by infants being separated from their parents without any due process sort of really whatsoever, right? Now the second thing is that the US is a repeat offender, as I said. Not only have they not signed up to the Child Rights Convention, and again, really, who has objection to children's rights, right? But also withdrawing from the Paris process, also unsigning the Rome Statute, which was against genocide, etc. Also withdrawing from now the Human Rights Council at a time when it is more needed than ever. And let me make this point front and center, because of course the reason that we in India should also look at what's going on with us and what is our relationship to this, right? It's a sort of frontal assault. It's yet another frontal assault on the international regime. Now, the point that they are making, their spin, is that it includes some of the largest human rights violators. It's true, it included the United States until today, right? It also includes China, it also includes Saudi Arabia. But the point is that a mechanism by which, if you are not getting your remedies, nationally, that a place where organizations who work on these issues have an independent voice. You know, at the moment there are some sittings of the Human Rights Council, and there are independent voices there speaking and bringing to the attention of these people the fact that, you know, that there aren't domestic remedies for every single thing. And most importantly, I think the fact that the world is so interconnected now, that there is no question of a particular sovereign country being able to deal with issues like climate change, able to deal with issues of violence that is spreading fast online. So, for example, you know, incitement to violence by organizations like ISIS, you have international terrorism, you have, you know, all sorts of challenges facing the world. And increasingly, I think that it's really burying one's head in the sand by taking this admittedly imperfect mechanism, but has done a large number of very, very positive things, right? And trying to sweep it under the carpet. And I think it also exhibits a certain ignorance of international law. Now, why would I say this? Because the earlier point I made that, you know, this regime came up in a particular environment, and that the current environment demands an even greater sort of acknowledgement and execution of standards in, you know, in agreements such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But also, like, we must recognize that it's not that the UN doesn't have any powers. The Security Council, for example, that India is quite keen to be a part of and should be a part of, right? Under, you know, Chapter 7, there a sort of concerted and agreement that there is a breach of the peace, and there is can then be, with legitimacy, then be implemented, right? Like, so what with the Iraq was, the problem was that the US just decided to go ahead on its own, which I think was a big problem. But no, but if the Security Council,
the point is, even in the Security Council, the same problem will emerge.
Multilateral approach to
even in the Security Council, the same problem will emerge, because, like one of our panelists said, that countries react and respond to this based on what really suits them. When it suits them, they can agree with the United Nations or any of their resolutions, and when it doesn't suit them, they can just turn around and question it. And that's how it has become. No country, when told that this is what is happening in your nation and take action, has actually ever accepted and responded in such a manner. Now, here is how the situation stands right now. Freedom House, an NGO that rates countries as free, partly free, or not free, according to the civil and political rights criteria, such as press freedom, has come out with the rankings for 2018. Now, according to the 2018 rankings, when it comes to Human Rights Council members, 21 free states are part of it, 12 of the countries are partly free according to these rankings, and 14 are not even free. 2018, in fact, is one of the worst years in terms of members of non-free HRC members. So, Meera Shankar, what are we talking about when the Council itself doesn't have members who respect the genesis of the Council? What kind of impact will it ever have?
But I think it has an impact which is more moral and, you know, which in a sense pushes international norms, often at a glacial pace, but it pushes them in the direction of institutionalization and universalization. It does not have specific teeth, because the UN Security Council has 5 permanent members of the UN, and they are in a position to veto. So the US is in a position to veto any action which would involve the Security Council getting teeth vis-a-vis the US, or vis-a-vis Russia, or vis-a-vis China, or vis-a-vis any of their allies, or the other permanent members such as UK or France. So we have to recognize that there are limitations, but I don't think we should let the best become the enemy of the good.
Correct.
I mean, it's serving a role, and that role is one which will push in the direction of expansion rather than limitation of freedom. Secondly, I think that, again, what was said by some of the speakers that domestic opinion and domestic institutions in many of the democracies are vocal on these issues and also gather strength from, what the UN Human Rights Council might say. And there's a symbiotic process. It's not that they function in isolation. Within the US, for instance, on President Trump's move to separate children, and while, the pushback of immigrants did happen also, illegal immigrants, did happen also under President Obama, I think the decision to actually criminally prosecute and jail the illegal immigrants and to separate the children is something which has come into effect from this May, and which is why there is such a furor about it within the United States.
Yes.
So I think, it is one institution, in a sense, symbiotically giving strength to voices which might actually speak for good sense, reason, and human rights within the society, because and nations, because no nation is perfect. There are flaws, and each nation naturally, strategically seeks to view this issue when it affects them.
Yes.
But when we look at it collectively, as I said, it's an institution which really moves things in a better direction rather than in a worse direction. So I think it's good that it exists.
But for example, Russia couldn't even get into the council in 2017, and it didn't really care about it. The United States has walked out of it the minute it was called out for its policies. The same UNHRC came out with one of its first reports on Kashmir, and the Indian government has outright rejected that. So I again come back to this aspect. What is the point? Is there a way of bringing in reforms that would give some more teeth to this organization, Mr. Shashank? Is that what we must look at? We have spoken about UN reforms in the past as well. Can that be effective?
Actually, this Human Rights Council is also a result of the reform which was carried out in the Human Rights Commission.
Yeah.
And it is supposed to carry out a dialogue with the individual countries on the basis of certain pointers, and then on the basis of that, every 3 or 4 years, a report is prepared. Now, what you are referring to is the report prepared by the Secretariat of the Human Rights Council, which is a totally different body. It is not answerable to anyone else. It is answerable only to the Secretary General. And that is what I am saying, that this body is not supposed to, they are not supposed to carry out any reports or be answerable about the objectivity of whatever they are preparing. So one can see that if India is critical of the Secretary General's report, of the Director General's report, it is not critical of the Council itself. It is quite willing to deal with the Council, to talk to the members of the Council, to explain as to what are the internal procedures in India, both NGOs as well as the human rights bodies which have been set up at various levels to take care of any complaints. And there might be some delays sometimes for investigation purposes, but at least India is able to do that. In the case of the United States, as a permanent member of the Security Council and as a major power, it is quite right. I mean, they are not going to subject themselves to anybody's scrutiny anywhere. And this is one of the fundamental principles of the setting up of the United Nations, because if you remember, USA refused to join the League of Nations only on this ground, that all small and big countries are being treated equally. So therefore, we have to keep in mind that if we want peace in the world, if we want to somehow to carry along countries like USA, Russia and others, we have to make sure that there is a dialogue with them. At the same time, we have to make possibilities open for bilateral, regional and international dialogues going on. In the case of Mr. Trump, it's becoming a bit difficult because he has been quite rude to all the European country members of G7, so which is now being called G6+1. Similarly, he is making separation with among the Asian countries. For example, he wants to put pressure on Iran, which is abiding by various international agreements which it signed with the P5+1. Whereas America has gone out of its way to shake hands with Kim Jong-un, who is able to hit the American establishments by his intercontinental ballistic missiles.
He does have an affinity for leaders who seem to have horrible records when it comes to these issues, and that seems to be becoming clearer and clearer by the day. Let me go across to Pramitpal Chaudhary then and put across this question. In 2018, in the new order of the world, what can really work to ensure that while the nations who are in violation of human rights norms are actually made to pay for it or made to change their policy?
I didn't quite catch what you said. You said what can be done to make violators of human rights
accountable?
Bring them to justice? Is that what you said?
Yes. How do you make them accountable?
Accountable. Yeah. You basically have to, I mean, what happens right now, just signing an international convention is actually meaningless unless a country is prepared to convert those conventions into domestic legislation. It always gets back to what you're going to do at home. If you don't do it at home, then you can sign any convention you want internationally. They're not binding. So what you end up doing is, as I mentioned, the European Union, for example, led the way, and sometimes the Americans, particularly when the Democrats were in charge, they have tended to say, okay, countries that violate human rights, or we will impose economic sanctions on that country. That's been the primary weapon that has been used. So if you rig an election, if you stage a coup d'etat, there's legislation in a lot of these countries that says immediately that country therefore faces some sort of economic repercussions of some variety. But you require a consensus among a fairly large number of countries about doing this. And you end up there automatically ends up being politics playing into this, because Pakistan regularly violates human rights, it regularly has coup d'etats, and America, because of strategic reasons, for example, has then said, oh, well, we'll skip imposing sanctions on Pakistan. Or the Europeans will say we'll not impose sanctions on a certain country in the Middle East, or so on and so forth. So it happens, but what you need is if you are able to get, for example, a large number of countries, the Western countries, maybe India, Japan, maybe occasionally Russia, China, to join you against specific human rights violations of a specific country, then you can impose an enormous degree of sanctions. For example, I think India is expecting a rigged election in the Maldives very soon, later this year. And I think India would support if other countries in the world impose sanctions on the Maldives as a consequence, because for obvious reasons India is not very happy with the present Maldivian government. So that's the way you're going to have to go forward, because the United Nations is not going to have the legal binding capacity to actually do anything. And the definitions, even internally within the United Nations, among its members, of human rights remain extremely vague.
Control the dialogue.
Kamal Mitra Chinoy, your thoughts on the same question. Is there a way to bring in some reforms in the current structure, or should we just disband UNHRC and probably look at setting up something completely new?
Look, you need some kind of coalition for this.
No.
For example, Paris climate change.
No, Karun, I'll come to you in just a bit.
Now,
I was asking Kamal Mitra Chinoy. Yes, go ahead, sir.
So about the Paris climate, there's one lesson to be learnt. That Obama said, okay, I'll come. But Trump said, we will not sign the Paris Climate Agreement. And what was the reason for that? Because the earlier agreements mentioned that those who are responsible for deterioration of the climate and the environment should pay for it. Likewise, when Trump wanted to favor Israel, the United States stated that we will recognize West Jerusalem as Israeli. So far it was considered as common to the Palestinians and Israelis. He insisted on it, was done. So the fact is that if there isn't a kind of condominium or group of powerful nations, as Mr. Shashank has said, they do come to get their way, whether they're all members of the Security Council or not, but there are some there. And therefore, in a case like this of separation of children from their immigrant parents, it is very difficult for the UN Human Rights Council to push it through. They can only use the weight of public opinion, as it also works in civil liberties unions and others in the United States. But they can't do very much apart from that. The UN is not an unyielding, fully empowered monitor. It is an organization of a collectivity. It has its strengths and it has its weaknesses when such situations come up.
Karuna Nandi, you wanted to also respond to that question?
Look, essentially, I think that I'm in partial agreement with Mr. Chaudhary and Mr. Chinoy, which is that it's a mixed body with mixed strengths and mixed weaknesses. But it's a body of long-standing and fairly legit, I think, or so that's been around so what we've got in terms of an international accord of how countries should function together in a multilateral manner, right? And it does still, to a very significant extent, have that legitimacy. And I'm talking about the UN system as a whole, not just the Human Rights Council. The Human Rights Council is something that has done a number of important and progressive things. So, for example, which the US has opposed, right? I think in terms of the ability to enforce things, it's, I think Mr. Chaudhary was saying that there is sort of a complete lack of ability to enforce things, and that's not correct. He spoke, I think, of economic sanctions, which is true, but you can also have, as I was mentioning earlier, the use of force under very particular circumstances with agreement is permitted when there is an act of aggression by one nation state against another. There is also for example, the Rwanda Tribunal and the Yugoslav Tribunal, where people actually go to jail. You have the Rome Statute. So there are various mechanisms that do function. And
Yes.
I think that it's quite right that India is interested in a seat in the Security Council. I think disagreements, one of the speakers before me said that there may be disagreements on particular issues and those can be raised. But I do think that strengthening rather than a rejection of the international accords is absolutely vital, particularly in this day and age where we cannot step away from international cooperation. And as long as we have objective standards,
No, so I'm not
we
at all
must
for
fight
even a
to
minute.
have those objective
Yeah,
standards
absolutely. I'm not at all
implemented objectively.
for even a minute suggesting that we completely end all dialogue or step away from any kind of international cooperation.
No,
In fact,
not you, but there are a number of other people who
I'm
are.
completely saying the opposite of that, that this system doesn't seem to be working. What I can remember is perhaps one example where nations did come together to act against a rogue nation was Libya.
And let me, if I can just give you some examples.
Yes, okay, go ahead. Because I was speaking about the Libya example, but
No, it
over
is-
and above that, what else have we successfully managed from the UNHRC?
Excuse me. Could I mention,
So the
South
Council
Africa?
condemned Israel's behavior repeatedly, right?
Okay, yes.
If I may just very quickly give you some examples where
Yeah.
the UN Human Rights Council has been sort of has acted quite positively. They've condemned Israel's behavior repeatedly with multiple resolutions.
But that did what?
Upsetting many who may perceive this as disproportionate
But
attention.
that did
right?
what? Karuna, it didn't make any difference
well,
to
I think
Israel.
that if
It
you
didn't
have-
stop Israel. 90 people were killed in the recent, action that took place. It's not done anything. That's my point.
Firing against unarmed protesters. But the reason that it's very important for a body like the Human Rights Council to make these statements and condemnations, even though I agree with you, it's only a statement, it's only a condemnation at this stage, is because it creates a body of, it creates a history, right? It also creates something that individual countries can use in citing a sort of international and more objective standard in their relationship with Israel.
Okay.
It's something that can build up to a potential use of force decision by the Security Council. It's something that can provide the build-up to a number of different things.
Right. Okay. So let me just
mandate of special
let me also 1 minute if I can interrupt you there, because Meera Shankar also wanted to make a point.
Things. It's very easy to find.
Yeah, Meera Shankar.
One case, for instance, where the UN did act and act successfully together, even though it was delayed, was against apartheid, where international sanctions were eventually, after many years of struggle, embraced by the international system, and that led to South Africa's isolation to a considerable extent and spurred some of the political changes which occurred within South Africa because of the trade and other sanctions which were put in place. So it can work, but it works when the geostrategic interests of the great powers are not at variance on a particular issue. Secondly, I think India has always held that we should avoid too much finger pointing on human rights issues, because these are used politically and become political tools against countries. Rather, we should engage in dialogue, and we should also work to strengthen democratic functioning by supporting countries which are fragile or making transitions towards democratic functioning. How do you help build the institutions? So there are positive roles that can be played, and the necessity of dialogue rather than finger pointing, I think, is something important. Say, even a country like India, to engage in a dialogue is far easier than to just have somebody telling us that, look, what you're doing is completely wrong. And if that happens, then we're liable to say, well, you don't understand the situation, and, your report is not serious. And that's what happens in a number of cases. So I do think that there are instances where such institutions be successful, but it depends on the geopolitics of the great powers. If they agree on an issue, action can take place. If there are divergences, then the fault lines tend to be according to the geopolitical orientations of the countries concerned.
I do agree with you when there are greater nuances.
Secondly, as I said, less finger pointing, more dialogue, more positive action to strengthen democratic institutions and human rights institutions in different countries, particularly countries which are making transitions in this direction.
I do agree with you that when it comes to greater dialogue between two nations, sure, it's a good platform. But honestly, apart from passing a resolution on paper and condemning what the other nation has done collectively or in a smaller majority, doesn't make a difference to the child who's crying, to the mother who's lost a child, a home, a family, to thousands of people who've been rendered homeless and are now roaming on streets of other countries looking for a home, pleading to people, give us some place, give us asylum, give us refuge. And there are European nations today who refuse to even do that, who are all busy coming up, just like Donald Trump, anti-immigrant policies, and I don't think any Human Rights Council or Human Rights Commission or United Nations is going to be able to do anything about that. Mr. Shashank, am I wrong when I say that? Which of these nations is going to listen to United Nations when they say that there are 5,000 Syrian refugees who will die if you don't accept them today? Let's do so.
I agree with you totally. If only we put this test and say, well, which countries would replace the money which was coming from the United States for the Human Rights Council? would the NGOs all over the world raise that money voluntarily, or would the countries in Europe or anywhere else, Arab countries or some other countries, would raise that kind of money so that all the action which is being done by the Human Rights Council would continue to be done? The basic point is that the UN organizations and their bodies are so inefficient, ineffective and very expensive that USA, which is one of the largest paymasters for these organizations, whether on a contributory basis or on a voluntary basis, is always able to hold them to ransom and tell them that, look, the US would pay provided they improve their conduct. And this is what they do, firstly on the administrative and financial grounds, and now this time on the question of Israel. They are saying that, look, you cannot just go on criticizing our friends. It will not be permitted. So what is required is really, we have to take everything together. That is the NGOs, the national human rights organizations, the kind of issues which are being raised. I mean, the Middle East is totally in turmoil.
Yes.
And now Daesh is moving towards Asia. So I wouldn't be surprised if what is happening in Middle East today would be happening in many of the Asian, Southeast Asian, other Asian countries tomorrow. So we have to be quite prepared for keeping our area peaceful. And I think the Indian leaders are doing their very best in the limited choices that are available to them to talk to the Chinese, to talk to the Russians, talk to the Europeans and others, and including Mr. President Trump, to ensure that Asia remains peaceful and these internal or international migrants are kept in a more secure environment. Their families can live together and they can have chance for their peaceful development and growth.
Well, President Trump may say what he wants to today to India, and then tomorrow he will most probably go back on those words, have another epiphany and then change his mind, as he has often done, because for him all that matters is America first. The rest of the world he doesn't care. He doesn't care what he does to families, to little children, and he's not the only one. We have leaders like that across the world in every single continent. I thank my panelists for joining us tonight. Even as we speak, viewers, there's a government in Hungary which has actually come out with special laws to take action against those who help immigrants. Yes, that's what some nations in Europe are doing. They want to come up with laws to take action against those who are helping refugees who've been rendered homeless. Those refugees who have survived bombings, mass killings, in some cases even chemical attacks, and they have traveled long distances with their families just for the hope of a better life. And we have countries in this world that turn around and say no and close their doors. And no organization, international or local, is able to do anything about it. We have ordered now, the United Nations Human Rights Council has ordered an investigation into the Gaza killings. They're going to come out with a report. Some people sitting in a room will discuss it, condemn it, and move on with their lives with absolutely nothing that will do to stop Israel. United Nations is not going to, United States of America won't allow it, Australia won't allow it, India will choose not to participate in it and point fingers. And that is the sad reality of this world. Human rights violations in every part, nations, governments, authorities refusing to acknowledge it at all. Can we come together to come up with a new system? United Nations may have worked in the post-World War era. It doesn't work in 2018. Can we come out with a new global association and a system that actually makes rogue nations accountable? That's the only question tonight. Thank you so much for joining us.